there, mateys. Hey, today I'd like to go over with you my methodology and philosophy of fixing up this old boat. Now, it's just the way I did it. There's a lot of other ways to do things, I'm sure. Just want to share with you, though, how I went about it. And I'm sure every boat is going to have a different set of priorities and tasks that need to be done. Now, this boat had sat on the hard for 15 years before I took it over. And the good part of it was, though, the previous owner had taken out the old Atomic 4 and put in a new 2-cylinder Yanmar. About 3 or 4 months later, he decided he needed a bigger boat, and he traded this one off. So the engine is like new. What had happened is this boat sat in the boatyard at the marina, and a storm came up, and for some reason or somehow it just got messed up. I mean, look at this. The port cleat was ripped out, the starboard side got smashed in, so this became an insurance issue. It sat on the hard and just kept going and going and going and going. 15 years later, I come by. I look at the boat and I go, oh man, the price is right, but what a piece of work to do. So I came up with a methodology and a philosophy of how to put this together. What I did is I came up with 9 separate areas or systems that needed to be fixed. My primary goal was to get the boat seaworthy and sailing as soon as possible, do fix up as I went along, you know, enhancements, upgrades, creature comforts, and those kind of things. Well, I'll go over the 9 points that I have. I'll just bullet them here, and then we can go over more of them later. Now, on my playlist on my YouTube channel, I've got probably 75 different videos of the fix-up that I did, and so check that out. I'll put a description, I'll put a link in the description, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so. We got more stuff coming up. I mean, it's a boat. There's always upgrades to do, always systems to fix, and other things to do with it. So the key areas that I came up with are, of course, first of all, I had to get the boat to where I could stay on it. That took several days. I mean, to clean out all the old mold and mildew stuff, I had to rip the headliner out. Cushions had to go. I mean, there were still cans of food and water on this boat. For a 30-foot boat, I can't believe how many black bags of trash I took out. But about 3 days, maybe it might have been 4 days, I was able to stay on the boat. I washed it all down, got everything cleaned up. So, well, we'll go into more detail on all of these later. Let me just list these for you. So, clean the interior, get the hull fixed up, electric, fresh water, the head, galley, engine, navigation and safety, and then the sails. Well, to achieve this, I put together what I call a critical path to whatever it is you're doing. Mine was critical path to get in the water and start sailing. So I wrote up a plan, and I think this is important too, to have a written plan. In my opinion, if you don't have a written plan, you really don't have a plan at all. Now, I put together a Gantt chart. You don't have to go that far, but you need some kind of a plan. Another important part is be flexible with it, because you may need to wait on some parts, so you need plan B. You don't want to just be sitting there with nothing to do, or the weather isn't quite right. So you need to be a little flexible. Well, another key point, at least for me, is finish one task all the way through. Don't jump from project to project to project. Now, like I said, you may need to do a few other little things while you're waiting for some parts. But for example, your water system. Do it all. Get all the stuff lined up, ready to go. Start at one point, get all the way to the end of it. Don't be jumping back and forth between things. You're just going to wind up with a lot of little stuff halfway finished. At least that's just my thought on it. So as I mentioned, to get on board and stay on board, a lot of cleanup, a lot of throwing things out. Oh, and when you find little parts, don't necessarily throw them away. Maybe put them in a bucket somewhere. You may find out that you need them someplace. I did that by mistake. Had to buy a couple of things. But I was so intent on getting everything cleaned up so I could work on it. The next thing was the hull. As I mentioned, this thing had been in some kind of storm, and parts of it, water was coming in the deck on the top side, and they drilled holes in the hull so the water could go out. So I needed to stop the leaks, get that fixed up, get the hull fixed up, and of course while I'm on the hard, get the bottom painted, check the rudder, the steering, the prop, through hulls. You want to do those while you're on the hard for sure. What I did is I took a little rubber mallet, well not little, big rubber mallet, not that I whacked them really hard, but I just tapped them. I had one of them break right off. Well, I could have shaken it and it would have broken off. So you want to get all these things fixed before you go in the water. The purpose and idea of getting in the water is that it's a lot easier to get on and off the boat and work on things, especially the engine. Now you could hook up a fresh water hose to it, but it's a lot easier to do that kind of stuff in the water. So I got it in the water, then I started working on the other items, like the electrical systems, AC and DC, had to all be rerun. All the wires needed to be rerun. There was so much corrosion on everything. Now eventually I did replace and upgrade the DC panel and the AC panels so that I had enough space for everything to add what I wanted to and make it safe. But to start with, I used what was there, but I ran new wire just about everywhere. Anywhere I could see there was wire, I ran new wire. I also found out that to certain items, it was just as easy to run the AC wire and the DC wire together rather than run all the DC wire, then come back and run all the AC, because I'm pulling things apart, opening up hatches, unscrewing boards. You know, this is where the plan comes in. If you have a written plan and you can see what you're going to be working on, you can make sure you got all your tools there, all the systems that you need, all the parts that you need, and work through that whole project. Now, on the freshwater side of things, man, I really needed to run new hoses to everything. These things were just so crusty. And to clean out the freshwater tank. Now, luckily, it had a opening. Well, that's how you fill the tank too. It's from that opening. I did eventually put a deck fill plate for it, but I was able to get in there, clean that up, run all new hose, new belt clamps, new faucets, pressure water. It didn't have pressure water, so I got a pump for that, got that set up, got that ready to go. And eventually I fixed up the galley. So eventually I did hook up a freshwater or shore water hookup on the boat. That way I didn't have to work out of the holding tank, because it's really a rather small tank. I think it's only about 20 or 25 gallons, which is fine for overnight, you know, a couple of overnighters. But on a regular basis, I'd be filling that quite frequently. Then I worked on the head, put all new hoses in, and oh man, was that a hassle, getting those hoses run around and everything. And here again, eventually I did take the head out and I put a composting toilet in. I like that a lot better. That opened up some more space. Again, I have videos on a lot of this stuff on the playlist. In the galley, I really didn't have a stove. What I used was a little camp stove and an electric plate. I fixed up something there. I took the old stove out. It was all falling apart anyway. Again, eventually I put in a propane stove, the refrigeration, just an ice box. No insulation in that at all. So I insulated that and I used it as an ice box probably, I don't know, almost a year before I got a good cold plate unit put in there. Made refrigeration a heck of a lot better. Then getting the engine started. Like I said, it was almost a new engine, but it sat for 15 years. The fuel tank, the fuel in that, it didn't have a fuel gauge, but there was a spot where you could take where the fuel gauge was, you could take that off and you could look in there. Well, eventually I did cut a access panel in that also. Now I wouldn't recommend that on a gas fuel tank, you know, a Spark or something, but diesel it wasn't too bad. I drained all the fuel out of it first, and then I cut an access panel. You got to make sure you use the right type of gasket and sealant for that, because it is diesel. And I'm glad I cleaned that out, because even though I pumped all the old fluid, all the old fuel out earlier, put new fuel in, there was so much debris in the bottom of that for the first 6 months it seemed like every time I went out I was changing the fuel filter. Finally I opened that up and got it cleaned out and haven't had a problem since then. So get that set up. Now I also have a video on there on how to put a fuel gauge in, how to calibrate the fuel gauge for an irregular tank, because you know my tank is a V shape and comes up on one side, low on the other. So when it reads half full, it's really not half full. When it reads a little bit over half full, I'm almost full. So you know, you kind of have to figure out what your fuel gauge is reading. You know, I just added a gallon at a time and kept an eye on where the gauge was. Took a while to get the engine running though. Change the oil filter, the hoses, some of those were corroded. But within about 8 hours, not all in one day, of working on it, got the engine running. That was very important. Then for my navigation, this boat had a lot of instruments on it. None of them worked, not even the depth sounder. So what I did for the depth sounder for the first year is I just went out and bought a cheap fish finder with a hockey puck for the transducer, and that worked out really well. And then I had a handheld VHF and a handheld chart plotter. So again, the idea was get out sailing, do the rest of the fix-up as I'm going, as long as the boat is seaworthy and safe, which it was with these items. Oh, even for an anchor light, I mean, there was nothing up there. So I would hoist up a battery lantern that would work for that, and then eventually I did get a tricolor light put on, ran new wires for that. The sails were in very good shape. Well, the main was in good shape. The Genoa was in decent shape, but after about a year, I mean, it started to show the wear on it already. So I sewed that up a little bit, some hand sewing, some machine sewing, put some new sheets on. I cleaned all the other lines, the halyards, soaked all of that, got that clean, and that I thought was important to do. Now I did say I was more important about the sailing ability of the boat than the looks of it, but I did want it to look halfway decent too. So scrubbing and waxing the hull was important, not just for looks, but I think that's important for the integrity of the vessel. Having it clean was a lot safer walking around. There wasn't slippery areas and stuff to trip on the hull. It just, well, it did. It looked better, and the water, I think, flowed over it easier. So there are a few cleanliness issues on that I think are just as important as the seaworthiness of the vessel. Well, that's kind of an overview of my methodology and philosophy of fixing up an old boat. I hope you find it helpful. Check out my DIY playlist. You might find some things in there that'll be helpful too. Well, until next time, guys, happy and safe boating to you, your family, and friends.